Welcome to another explainer. So, today we're diving into the bizarre, honestly kind of dark origins of a word that haunts, well, pretty much every student and office worker. I mean, the word deadline sounds incredibly ordinary to us, right? We chase them, we miss them, we panic at 11:59 p.m., but the word itself carries a much, much older and darker meaning. This isn't just some story about a modern office term getting a little dramatic. No, this is a literal linguistic mystery about how a deadly physical boundary just sort of became a completely normal part of our everyday vocabulary.
Think about what actually happens today if you blow past a deadline. You might tank your grade in a class, you might face the totally mundane anxiety of letting down your team, or, having an incredibly awkward conversation with a client. But contrast that with the cynical humor that, hey, at the very least, your boss isn't going to literally shoot you. The consequences are social, academic, financial, they aren't mortal. But the phrase itself, it is a literal ghost from the past.
Let's completely yank the narrative back to the 1860s. Back then, the dictionary definition of a deadline combined two very simple words in a brutally literal way. We're talking about a physical line drawn either within or right around a prison that a prisoner passed at the absolute risk of being fired upon. The danger wasn't metaphorical in the slightest, it was a literal matter of life or death.
Section 1. Inside the Stockades, the American Civil War.
To really understand this, we have to set the scene. By 1863, prisoner exchanges were suspended, which led both the Union and the Confederacy to suddenly construct these massive, horribly overcrowded military prison camps. And one of the most infamous was the Confederate prison of Andersonville down in Georgia, officially known as Camp Sumter. Now, this place was originally designed to hold roughly 10,000 inmates, but a staggering 45,000 Union soldiers would eventually walk through its stockade gates. It was crammed way beyond belief, completely lacking adequate housing, food, clothing, or even basic medical care. The sensory reality of this camp was just horrific. We have memoirs from survivors, like the journalist John McElroy, who described his fellow soldiers as stalwart men, now nothing but mere walking skeletons, covered with filth and vermin. Prisoners arrived to find literally no shelter, so they burrowed right into the ground, living in these makeshift mud huts they called shebangs. The whole camp was bisected by a tiny creek that served as their only water source. And worse, it was situated right downstream from the guard camps, so it became unspeakably foul.
So the really crucial question here is, how on earth do you control a desperate, starving population of that size? Well, the prison was enclosed by a 15-foot-high pine log stockade. And exactly 20 feet inside that wall, running completely parallel to it, was a light rail fence. This 20-foot no-man's land was the literal deadline, just a rigid, physical boundary separating the prisoners from the outer wall strictly meant to prevent escapes and just keep those massive crowds at bay. And the enforcement of this line? Absolute terror. Just take a look at this quote from the 1865 war crimes trial of Andersonville's commandant, Captain Henry Wares. Guards, who were often just young, totally inexperienced boys or older men, were stationed up in these pigeon roosts every 30 yards. They were explicitly instructed to fire a lethal charge of buck and ball at absolutely anyone who even touched, fell upon, or slipped under this boundary. The line was totally merciless.
The grim outcome of all this is a stark reminder of the realities of that era. Over its 14 months of operation, nearly 13,000 men perished inside Camp Sumter. They died from disease, intense malnutrition, horrible exposure to the elements, and of course, the lethal enforcement of camp rules like the deadline. It was just a tragic, monumental loss of life in an incredibly concentrated space. Moving on to Section 2, the myth versus the reality of wartime crowd control. Because the horrors of Andersonville were so intensely publicized during the war crimes trials right after the Civil War, a pretty powerful myth took root. The myth being that Andersonville alone invented the deadline. But if you look at historical diaries from as early as 1863, they show us that while Andersonville definitely popularized the sheer terror of the term, the reality is that deadlines were actually a standard feature of military crowd control in both Union and Confederate prison camps. It really wasn't isolated to just one side or one specific camp.
Depending on the prison you were in, the actual physical form of the deadline varied quite a bit. Up at the Union prison at Rock Island, it was a series of white stakes that they'd illuminate with lanterns at night. Down at Belle Isle, it was an embankment and a trench. Morris Island just used rope tied between stakes, while Florence had a low rail fence.
But honestly, whether it was marked by wood, rope, or a literal ditch, the universal concept of wartime crowd control was exactly the same across the board. Do not cross, or you will be shot.
All right, Section 3, From Prisons to Printing Presses. So, how on earth did this macabre tool of 19th century warfare become a standard fixture of your modern workplace? Well, the linguistic journey is a fascinating mystery. Historians are pretty cautious about drawing one single direct line from those prison yards straight to your office cubicle, but the word undeniably shook off its literal violence and took on a completely new kind of urgency over the next few decades. By 1904, it was being used as an economic restriction. Factories instituted a deadline age, usually around 35, beyond which they literally just wouldn't hire you. But then, right around 1917, the term found a very specific physical home in the printing industry.
Let's look really closely at that 1917 jump. The printing industry ended up adopting the term literally once again, but this time for machines, not men. A deadline described a very specific byline on the bed of a printing press. Basically, if the metal type fell outside this line, the text would not print properly. It was dead space. So it was still a physical boundary, but a boundary of functionality. But, as we all know, the news business is built entirely on speed. By 1920, newsroom jargon had taken this spatial printing line and transformed it into a temporal one. To get a newspaper printed and distributed on schedule, editors instituted an absolute final minute that copy could be submitted before the presses had to run. The deadline literally shifted from the physical edge of the printing press to the tick of the clock. And from the newsroom, the word just exploded outward. You know, journalists write the first draft of history, but they also export their slang. This journalistic time limit definition rapidly infiltrated schools, universities, business, finance, law, publishing, and eventually just everyday life. The original physical danger of the Civil War stockade was entirely forgotten. It got completely replaced by the modern anxiety of just getting things done on time. Which brings us right back to you. Are you racing against a deadline today? Are you being killed by deadlines this week? It is honestly incredible to think about the dark irony hiding right there in our everyday speech. We use these intense life and death metaphors all the time, without ever realizing how brutally literal they sounded just over a century and a half ago. We have basically domesticated a word that was born in the crosshairs of a rifle. So, the next time you feel the pressure of a looming project, or you're rushing to hand in an assignment at 11:59 p.m., keep this lingering thought in your head. Every single time you invoke this mundane corporate buzzword, you are actually invoking a ghost of the Civil War. Because once upon a time, a deadline was not a date on a calendar, it was a line on the ground. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep your curiosity alive.